Welcome to Fraser and Dieter's Culture of Compliance podcast series, where we discuss compliance as a competitive advantage in today's marketplace. I'm Sabrina Serafin, partner and national leader of Fraser and Dieter's process, risk, and governance team. Today, we're talking to Brian Powers, the founder of Pactsafe. And Brian, you have an interesting background. Brian first studied engineering, then became an attorney, and now has built on that knowledge to found a technology company that he's going to talk to us about today. Brian, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Excited to chat today.
Great. Brian, we asked you to join us today to talk specifically about some of the scenarios in which contract acceptance technology, and we'll have to explain what that is, but how that can support compliance officers. Brian, we click accept multiple times a day, a week, a month. Are there any concerns that we as users should have before we hit that button?
Look, at the end of the day, there should be no difference between that type of contract and any other type of contract. You always have to have, for it to be binding, you always have to have the opportunity to review it. You have to know that taking some sort of action is a manifestation of assent against the contract. So, it's almost like, most people don't read the entire mortgage before they sign it, or they don't read their entire apartment lease before they sign it. But as long as they have the opportunity to do so, and they know that when they're signing something, on the line, like all the words that are in that packet of paper in front of them are binding against them, and that they had a chance to review it. So it's a question that we get asked all the time. And, a lot of companies can screw it up. If you're not presenting terms in the right way, akin to like asking somebody to signing a contract with half of it hidden on a tabletop and not letting them look at it, right? Like that's not going to be enforceable. As far as what the contents of any of those contracts, like I said, it's the same as any other contract. If it's something that you don't want to accept, or you want to understand what you're accepting fully before you click it, then you should click on the link and read it. Most people aren't going to do that. Just like reading, like I said, a long auto contract or a mortgage agreement, but they are, they are intended to be binding contracts. But I think even most lawyers don't read them before they click on them,
Right. Can you start off by telling us more about your background and the problem that you wanted to solve when you started your company?
Sure. So like you said, I started my career as an engineer, not a software engineer, an environmental engineer, designing wastewater treatment plants, which has pretty much nothing to do with anything I do now. But when I moved on to practicing law, mostly focused on representing tech companies, and saw this interesting problem that they were having with the types of contracts that you're accepting when you click on something, right? And that's called a click wrap agreement. Mm-hmm. So think about when you sign up for an app, or you buy something online, and you're checking a box to accept terms and conditions, terms of service, whatnot. Those are supposed to be binding contracts, right? There's trillions of them that have happened over the past 20 years. But there was, every other contract in a business has a very sophisticated technology stack to help manage it, from document management to e-signature all the way to contract lifecycle management. And for click wrap agreements, there's nothing until Pactsafe came along. So we decided to build a platform that would plug in and enable businesses to very securely, in a centralized fashion, power massive scale click wrap contracts. And so that started out manifesting itself mostly where you would expect, where we have customers like Wayfair, where, they're doing millions of click wrap agreements a day. We're plugged in behind the scenes, making sure that their legal team can update those, can manage them, and can prove that, hundreds of thousands of millions of people accepted different sets of terms over different periods of time. So that's where it started. And what's been interesting is how that type of contract methodology has been consumed by other types of businesses as we've grown as a business.
So provide us an example of a specific problem that was solved for organizations.
Sure. So a couple of ways to answer that. So like I said, the original use case for Pacsafe was plugging into a business that already had lots of click wraps, right? So their business was click wrap was part and parcel to the way they conduct business. So think e-commerce, software as a service, anything where the primary interaction between the business and their customers is something online or in a mobile app. And so the problem that we were solving there was, right, like you're deploying these online agreements, terms and conditions, whatever, to some point of acceptance somewhere. And legal teams had no way to make sure that those were being updated in a timely manner without going through multiple layers of engineers, product managers, whereas any other type of contract or policy in their business, right, as laws change, as you need to make updates to your standard agreements, you just go into a document management system, extract the template, make an edit in Word, and dump it back in. Mm-hmm. And that's very important, right? Especially from a compliance perspective, as you have policies and things that have to be updated based on changes to the law and whatnot. You have to be able to timely react to that stuff. These types of agreements are just as important, right? Changes are made to the law. You have to make updates to your copy, to your terms, your provisions. And it was taking months just to go and do something as simple as maybe add a sentence or correct a typo. So with our platform, we eliminated all those layers between where the agreements are presented and where the legal teams can make changes to them. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, right, like even worse, if you can't prove that somebody has reviewed or accepted a policy or a contract, what's the point? And a lot of times at these massive scale type agreements, you're not able to do that, or to do it, you have to go through months of data mining with engineers and whatnot. So with Pacsafe, people could just click a button, and prove who accepted what and when they accepted it and generate records for that.
Right. Now, clearly, e-commerce and digital media businesses had to get a handle on this ahead of B2B companies. But here we are in 2020, the year that every company had to rapidly change how we do business and how we interact with our clients, our vendors, our employees. Can you share your thoughts on some of the ways this technology is being applied to help businesses adapt processes to a remote workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we had started to see before COVID, and has become even almost exponentially more relevant during the COVID age, right? Where you started to see over time people consumer buying habits and what even we lawyers were accustomed to do, right? We became very, very familiar and comfortable with clicking on something to accept it when we're buying something online, and started to see that type of mindset make its way into the business to business world, where very smart in-house legal teams and product teams were starting to say, okay, well, we have all these contracts that we really shouldn't be spending time on. There shouldn't be a legal intake process. We should not be redlining these things. How can we make our NDAs, our internal policies and procedures, our vendor onboarding documents, stuff like that, our sales contracts that aren't changing very often? How can we make those more of a self-service experience where people just go somewhere and click on it and they're done with it, as opposed to the process of sending an email out, having them open the email, open it in an e-signature product, maybe open it in Word, edit it, send it back, do all of those things. How do we become a more digital-friendly, digital-first organization that embraces things that people are used to doing now? And what's been interesting about COVID is it really forced the hand of pretty much every business on the planet to start figuring out how do we become a more digitally friendly business, right? Digital transformation was no longer something that businesses wanted to strive to achieve. It was something they were forced to achieve because people were stuck in their houses, and it wasn't just customers stuck in their houses, right? It was the people on the other side of the transaction as well, the lawyers, the business people. So what we've seen is, the same thing that allows for a click wrap to work very well for e-commerce, right? Has become something that more and more businesses are trying to adopt, in this environment and beyond, to say, okay, we know now that we've wasted too much time, with these old school methodologies and legacy frameworks that rely on things that look and feel like paper. Let's figure out how to speed all this up, right? Let's figure out how to just make these contracts, even if it's something that traditionally has been something we emailed to people and looked like paper on a screen. Let's figure out how to just put them in front of people and let them click on it and be done with it.
Well, Brian, a lot of our listeners represent middle market organizations, and we found often that these smaller companies find that solutions that help large companies are hard to adapt for their smaller environment. Can you give us some examples of how compliance teams in middle market companies are using this technology?
So one of the things that we learned very early on, one of the differences between our enterprise buyers and our mid-market buyers were that at the enterprise level, there's always a plethora of technical resources, whether it be engineering teams, product teams, people that can buy our platform and build things on top of it. It's usually a typically very bespoke integration heavy thing that they're doing internally with the way our platform works. What we've seen at the mid-market level is that if we can put tools in front of them on top of our platform that allow them to very quickly replicate what's happening at the enterprise level without a ton of internal resources being required to do that, that it's going to put them in a position to be successful. So, we've built out a bunch of different products and tools on our platform that allow a company to, say, drop a policy or some type of standardized agreement into the platform, and within seconds have a click wrap ready agreement that they can just share a link, post a link somewhere, they can deploy it to their team. And now it's a hosted version of a click wrap agreement, as opposed to something that requires it to be embedded into some other experience on a website or an app. So that's been really, really helpful, and we continue to build out all sorts of tools that allow the time it takes for a mid-market company to start realizing value and deploying click wrap as a transformational thing. Minimizing that time has been pretty important, and something that they've been able to do pretty successfully, even with the lack of enterprise resources.
That's great to hear, and our audience will appreciate that as well. When we were preparing for today's podcast, you mentioned the concept of an acceptance mindset. Can you talk about that for a bit?
Absolutely. Something that we're pretty passionate about at Pacsafe. So probably the best way to start there is the flip side of that coin is what we call the ink mindset. And that is thinking about contracts the same way or along the same lines as like, what were we doing with contracts when it was all paper, ink, and file cabinets, right? And you look at a lot of the ways that the existing products out there that have been around for 20, 30 plus years, the way they facilitate, making contracts a more digital process as opposed to, manual and paper and all that. It doesn't look a whole lot different, right? You've digitized file cabinets. You've created documents that look like they're printed out on paper. You're signing documents of squiggly lines that look like ink. And what ends up happening is you have this very rigid mindset into how to innovate around a problem. And so what we've done is we talk about what's called the acceptance mindset, which is taking abstracting contracts way further back into not thinking about them as ink and paper, but just collections of words and phrases that have to be assembled and accepted in some shape, form, or fashion. And we built our platform from day one without the acceptance mindset as a thing, because we had to be able to facilitate these massive scale, clickable transactions. And then what we saw is we saw customers wanting to adopt that for other types of contracts. We had to help them get into the right mindset, into the thinking and realizing that you can use this, you can turn all sorts of contracts into clickable things. And so we call that the acceptance mindset, where it's figuring out, what is the ideal state for a business if you did not have contracts and policies and things that have to be acknowledged and accepted as a part of a business transaction, looking at what that ideal state looks like, and then figuring out, okay, well, what are the ways that we can standardize and minimize the friction created by contracts, policies, or whatever, and inject those back into those transactions. And typically the end result looks quite a bit different from what you started out with. Because if you're following the old legacy approach, you're going to have a transaction that every single time is going to have some tangent, some blocker that's going to manifest itself in the form of a contract or a policy, where it's like the transaction's moving along. Now we have to stop it. We have to do something completely separate, which is getting a contract reviewed or signed. And it's like, why don't we make that a more organic part of the overall transaction? This doesn't work for every type of contract, right? Like there's lots of contracts that are going to be highly negotiated back and forth between lawyers for weeks on end. These are the types of contracts that either are standardized or should be standardized. They should change relatively. They should never change, or they should change relatively infrequently. And then figuring out, how do you turn those into things that people are accepting versus signing, right? So it's a mindset thing that ultimately we've seen our customers very successfully deploy to, reduce the amount of time that legal is spending on lower value contracts and paper. But, even more importantly to the underlying business, increasing business velocity by reducing all that contract friction. And adopting the acceptance mindset is typically a pretty transformational process for them. It's kind of the foundation upon which you can start adopting different technologies to really accelerate things in ways that you might not even think were possible before.
Well, thank you, Brian. Appreciate your describing Pactsafe and bringing to light some additional thoughts that businesses should take into consideration when dealing with multiple contracts. And to our audience, thank you for listening to Fraser and Dieter's Culture of Compliance podcast. Please join us for our next episode as we continue to discuss transforming compliance requirements into investments in your business.
Thanks for listening to one of Fraser and Dieter's branded podcasts. To learn more, connect with us on LinkedIn or visit us at FraserDieter.com and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode.